Yes, when the word came to the headquarters of the Peace Corps, where I was serving as chief of psychiatry, I was asked to come down to Mr. Schreiber's office. He and the president's sister, who was his wife, Eunice Kennedy Schreiber, were out visiting the doctor. She was pregnant, and so we waited until they came back, and then, of course, at that point, all we knew was that something had happened. And then the press officer passed us a message that it was a headshot. And then, of course, the next message was that the president had died.
That must have been difficult to tell family members. Aside from the fact he's your boss, Sergeant Schreiber was your boss and it's his wife, but it was also her brother and the president of the United States at the same time.
Well, you're right, and I'm a psychiatrist, so I ought to know something about how to deal with a situation like that. But I never felt more helpless in my life when I was going to have to tell them about this, because I had gotten the cable. And after I did, I'll never forget, Mr. Schreiber said, well, let's kneel down and say the rosary for Jack. And we knelt around his desk and did that, which gave me a chance to think about some things that might be helpful. But I was always grateful to Mr. Schreiber for doing that.
That must have been it certainly was difficult for everybody around the country, around the world that weekend, but being so close in on the actual events must have been difficult for you as well.
Well, it was. We left Mr. Schreiber's office. They sent a White House car for us, and we went over there in time to get a message from Robert Kennedy, who was in Dallas, asking Mr. Schreiber to begin plans for the funeral from when the plane arrived in Washington. And so he asked me to stay on to help him. And of course, in a way, we were the fortunate ones because there was so much to do. We were so busy, and people were coming in from all over the government. I mean, there were people from the Supreme Court, from the Congress, from the diplomatic world, all coming in to this office where Mr. Schreiber was beginning the planning process. And you could see the impact that this news was having on everyone.
Did the fact that you had so much to do that weekend, I guess, give you some escape from the trauma of it, so that you obviously had to deal with it, but at the same time, there's a lot of other little details that took up your time and your energy.
Well, you're right. It did, and as a matter of fact, even allowed some humor in a situation like that, which is almost unbelievable. But one of the things that I was asked to do by Bill Moyers, who came back from Texas, he had worked at the Peace Corps with us, but really as the chief of staff for the new president. And Bill said the president was very concerned that the funeral be done exactly as the Kennedy family wanted it to be, because he felt not only this country but the world would grieve through the funeral, and so it was very important that it be as they would like. So Bill asked me to keep an eye on things, as it were, and if there were any difficulties, to let him know. And Mr. Schreiber, in trying to get it organized, was suggesting that there should be a military guard of honor from the church to the gravesite. And I think the general in charge of the District of Columbia thought he was talking to a sergeant, not Sergeant Schreiber. He was not terribly accommodating. And then Mr. Schreiber asked about the possibility of a flyover, and the Air Force aide that was there said, no, we couldn't do that because the airplanes would scare the horses that will be bearing the case on. So I thought, well, that's my cue. So I went down to where the president was holding his first cabinet meeting, and believe it or not, was able to knock on the door, and Bill came out, and I told him the problem, and he said, just wait one moment, and out comes the Secretary of Defense, Mr. McNamara. He says, let's go down and see Mr. Schreiber and find out what these problems are. So, of course, he went down, sat on the armchair where Mr. Schreiber was sitting as he was, and said, Sarge, I understand we have some problems. And Schreiber said, yes. He said, we were hoping that there might be an honor guard, but apparently there aren't enough troops available here in the district. So the Secretary of Defense, who was recognized immediately by that general, said, General, if it takes 50 troops, they'll be there. If it takes 500, they'll be there. If it takes 50,000 and we need to mobilize the reserves, start it immediately. Well, I think that general saluted 12 times within that sentence, and it was clear that that was going to happen. And then Shriver turned to Sarge and said anything else. He said, well, the problem of the flyover, they're afraid it's going to scare the horses. Well, the Air Force aide knew that it was his turn. And the secretary said to the Air Force aide, General, I want on my desk before the close of business today the exact altitude at which airplanes can fly over without disturbing horses. Of course, the Air Force aide said, yes, sir, you will have it. And so there was a magnificent honor guard as a result of that, and the flyover occurred perfectly, and the horses didn't mind a bit.
As I remember right, even Air Force One was part of that flyover.
That's exactly right. Exactly right.
The fact that you took such a deep role in the planning of that funeral, it still goes down as one of the great events. And aside from the fact that we were all mourning at the death of the president, it was still one of the great planned events on the spur of the moment, that everything seemed to go so perfectly, and it was so moving and meaningful to many people. It must give you some satisfaction to know that you had played such an important role in that.
Well, and one of the unsung heroes was Angie Biddle-Duke, who was the chief of protocol in the White House at that time. And whenever I had a free moment, he would grab me. And some of the questions were unbelievable. In the East Room was standing the greatest assemblage of heads of state the world had ever seen come together. And obviously there was going to be a march to the cathedral, and they had to be lined up. And Angie's question was, who's going to go in there and line them up? And so we discussed that for a while and decided that we'd let them line themselves up. And that's exactly what they did. And of course, the first one among all was the Emperor of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie, who they all respected. But, there was that kind of thing. Later, the question was whether the casket should be open or closed. The new president, was really anxious that the casket be open so that people could see that this had really happened and it wasn't some business of mystery, because no one knew at that moment really what had happened. Mrs. Kennedy really thought she preferred that the casket be closed, but she asked Secretary McNamara and myself to view the remains. And so they closed off the East Room, and we went in and they opened the casket. Of course, you could see what that shell had done to the back of Mr. Kennedy's head. And although the undertakers had done their thing, I think both Mr. McNamara and I felt that this was not the way people would want to remember their president. And so we recommended that though it would be possible to have it open, that it be closed, and that's what she decided to do. And so it was closed, and then there were tremendous security concerns because still no one knew what had happened. There was some suggestion that this might be prelude to a first attack by the Soviet Union. And it was really an atmosphere one would never forget. So when Mrs. Kennedy decided that she was going to walk, not take the car to the cathedral from the White House for the funeral mass, the president, who the Secret Service wanted in a car, said no way. And so the president marched behind Mrs. Kennedy and the children, and then of course all the heads of state followed. And I was asked to join that procession. They got me into a mourning coat because the emperor was not well and they were afraid that he might not make it. So I was asked to walk in this procession behind the emperor, who did fade a bit, but he finally made it. And we could hear the Secret Service radios, and there was a rumor that there was someone on the roof of one of the buildings out for de Gaulle. And we heard later that someone had been taken away by the Secret Service. So it was quite, the tension surrounding almost everything that happened was beyond belief.
I know that in reading William Manchester's book, I guess there was some of the discussion about that. There was Mrs. Kennedy who insisted that they march, and that the gentlemen, the heads of state, said if she's walking, we're walking. That's
exact. It started with the president. That settled it for the president, because the Secret Service obviously wanted him in a car, but he said, no, she walks, we all walk. And then everybody voluntarily followed suit.
And as you said, Haile Selassie was not in the best of health to make that trip.
No, he wasn't, and yet I'm told that he was the first head of state to arrive in Washington. He so loved John Kennedy. And I'll never forget, that the march was late, and again, Mr. Duke was concerned that these folks were standing there and waiting, and so he suggested that I had been asked to develop a mass card for the funeral, the traditional Catholic mass card, and he thought it would be very nice if Mr. Shriver took the mass cards in rather than wait till the funeral mass and present them to each of the heads of state, and at the same time apologize for the delay. And so I ended up carrying the box and walking in to that room, and there was the emperor standing first, de Gaulle behind him. You can imagine the contrast in height, and Prince Philip and so forth. And so Mr. Shriver went up to the emperor and said, Your Majesty, this is a card that will help you remember John Kennedy, who loved your country. And the emperor, with tears streaming down his face, said, Mr. Shriver, we need no card in Ethiopia about Mr. Kennedy because we have 300 of his children serving in our country. The 300 Peace Corps volunteers, one of the first groups that went abroad. And as we made the rounds, almost every one of those heads of state or whoever was representing a particular country made some comment about the Peace Corps and Kennedy, largely because it was Shriver, but largely because of the impact that program was having around the world.
As someone who was connected with the Peace Corps, that must have been rather satisfying to you to see that type of reaction from these people.
Well, it was tremendous because I didn't think the Peace Corps volunteers understood the impact they were having. And one of the concerns that the new president had was, would they come back? And he was afraid it would sort of signal the end of the Kennedy era. These were Kennedy's children, and now that he was dead, they would come back. And again, I was asked by Bill to give an opinion on this. As a matter of fact, he wanted me to come into the cabinet room and discuss it. Well, sometimes you have to know how to say no. So I said, no, I can't do that. He said, well, you've got to do something because the president needs to be reassured. So I found out the power of a White House phone. I picked up the phone and said to the operator, could you get me Gerald Kaplan at the Harvard Medical School, who was our principal consultant for developing the mental health program of the Peace Corps. How they do it, I don't think anybody knows, but within 10 minutes I had Gerald Kaplan on the phone. And you can imagine what it was like to get a call from the White House, the world watching what was going on television. And I said, Gerald, will they come home? He said, absolutely not. He said, they will be rededicating themselves as a result of this. I said, well, how do we convince the president of that? He said, well, now that's a different story. I said, Gerald, they're going to be in touch with you. The Air Force will arrange a plane. And I would appreciate your going to Bogota, Colombia, as soon as they can get you down there, meeting with the volunteers. It was one of the first groups of volunteers, and getting word back to us through the Signal Corps. There were no cell phones as to what you can say based on this contact with the volunteers. That evening, Gerald was in Bogota, Colombia, and when the Air Force moves, it moves. I never was able to check. I think he went down in a fighter plane. And in any event, he was able to reach us through the Signal Corps and said, you can tell the president that these are typical volunteers. They're not only not coming back, but he said, there is a problem for them. And I said, well, what is that, Gerald? He said, well, the problem is that the rest of the world is going to be able to grieve by watching the television portrayal of the funeral. These volunteers, there's no television out there. They're lucky if they have shortwave radio, and they're not going to have the same instrument, really, to help them come to grips with this that everyone else will have. So I said, well, let me report that to Mr. Shriver, who called the president, the new president, and either he or someone representing the new president called Mr. Sulzberger at the Times and asked if they would put together the coverage of the funeral. There was going to be, that may have been why there was a special section developed in the New York Times. But before 10 days was over, every Peace Corps volunteer in the world had the New York Times coverage of that event. It was one of the few things that Peace Corps Washington did that they thought was good. So there's some of the things that happened, and the attention given, particularly by the new president, to something like, would the volunteers be marching back home?
Now, 50 years down the road from that weekend, how do you think America has coped with that weekend?
Well, I think that the remarkable celebration, in a way, of the event and the contribution of the Kennedy administration, as brief as it was, and the words that he said. I mean, the remarkable activities that are going on this week, the 50th anniversary, I think is a measure of how we treasure that period. And I suppose some would suggest that what he said to young people, ask not what you can get from your country, but what you can do for your country, that may not be quite the same spirit today that it was then, which is a product of our culture, and I think people yearn for a return to that. And let's hope this memorial celebration may help to do that.
Do you think that, I mean, from your perspective as a psychiatrist, what do you think that weekend, that act, did to the American psyche? The way we think, the way we act, the way we believe, the way it affected us as Americans?
I think we understood in a new way the fragility of life, and that we never know how long or short it's going to be. I mean, can you think of anyone with greater promise that had more of a reason to live, and suddenly it was over? And that therefore, with what time we get, we should make the best of it. He did, and I think it's moral to us to do the same.
Well, thank you very much. Appreciate it.